Well, welcome to the third and final week of this message series. Welcome to everyone. A special welcome to someone who might be joining us for the very first time today, or the first time in a long time, perhaps just the first time in this series. We're glad that you are with us for its conclusion. And this series we are calling Lost and Found. And it is a good title because the truth is that it is surprisingly easy for us to get lost. Even in the marvelous new world of universally accessible GPS, I have managed it more than once, and probably some of you as well. It's easy to get lost. It's easy to get lost in your car, even with GPS sometimes, but it's even easier to get lost in the course and on the journey of your life. In your car, after all, unless you're driving through the wilderness, you can always stop and ask someone for directions. In some ways, life is the same. There is no shortage of people who want to give you directions. It's just that they often contradict each other. And so, it's easy to get lost. Now, the first week of our series, we talked about how we are often preoccupied and anxious with the affairs of this world. Things like work and career, politics, the pandemic, which makes all of us anxious and worried, and even more ordinary things related to family, hockey, soccer, dance. All of these occupy our heart and our mind, and we recognize that they are important, but not eternally important. Not important, ultimately. We recognize that we cannot and should not ignore these things. They are important after all, but we also asked, will they be something the Lord asks us about when we finally meet him face to face? Will they, and our involvement in them, be the measure by which our time on this earth is finally judged? It's a good question, and not ever asking that question may leave us lost. Busy, preoccupied, but lost. Without knowing, we are lost. That's not the only way, though, we can end up lost. Last week, we talked about how we can also become lost, or at least feel lost, when the burdens and troubles of the present moment weigh us down. And carrying them, we can't even lift up our head. We can no longer raise our head to see the road that lies ahead. All we can see is where we are at this moment, and what we see is not good. In those moments, we also feel lost. Probably if we have lived long enough, we have all had seasons like that in our lives. Perhaps some of you are in such a season right now. A job lost, a mortgage that we cannot figure out how to pay, a loved one who has died, gone forever, a hope that has finally and forever been destroyed, an addiction or an illness that controls our life or the life of someone we love, a family torn apart, either completely or far enough that we know things will never be the same. Sometimes, like Job, we are just standing in the middle of trials and suffering, trying to make sense of it all. And if we try and make sense by creating our own version of what people call karma, by persuading ourselves that the good and the bad will somehow balance themselves out, well, if we try that, we will ultimately fail. God has given us only one answer to our questions: his Son. Because the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost. Jesus is the Father's answer to our questions. But it might not be the answer we expected or hoped for, because Jesus is not fulfilling the function of some sort of magic wand that's going to make all of the bad stuff in our life disappear. That's not the way it works. Rather, if we know the story of Jesus, we know that he, in the person of God, drew near to us. He became one of us. He walked with us. He talked with us. He lived with us. But he also suffered with us and for us. And at the end of his life among us, nailed to the cross, dying, struggling for every breath, he spoke to his Father as one of us, using, in fact, the words from one of the Psalms. my God, why have you forsaken me?" In a certain sense, in that moment on the cross, and we do need to be very careful of how we speak in this context, but in a certain sense we can say Jesus experienced being lost. He experienced what we experienced in death as in life. Now this week we're going to look at another experience of being lost, and that is the experience of being alone, of being isolated. This whole season of COVID, it seems a never-ending season in some ways, it's meant that many of us have shared at least a little bit of that experience of loneliness and isolation, either directly and personally or compared to what we have come to refer to as normal times. If we are elderly, we may have been cut off from our friends and loved ones for our own protection and theirs for many weeks, cut off. And indeed, that situation might still continue today. If we are very young, we have been separated from our friends and our teachers for months at a time. The range of our daily experiences has been drastically limited, and we have suffered for that. And all of us, whether young or old, have been quick to discover that virtual conversations and gatherings, even online education, can't easily replace the real thing, can't easily replace the experience of being in the same place at the same time. We may not have been completely alone, some of us may, but most of us may not have been completely alone, but we know more than we would like to about that feeling of loneliness and isolation. But there are other, even more challenging ways that some of us may have had that experience, ways that actually have nothing to do with COVID. And to help understand them, we're going to turn back to today's readings. Our first reading today was from the book of Leviticus. Leviticus is one of those first 5 books of the Bible, and it's set during Israel's 40-year desert journey after escaping slavery in Egypt. They wandered, so it seemed, in the desert for 40 years on their way to the Promised Land. And the Bible, including the book of Leviticus, records many dangers on that journey along the way. Israel encountered other warring nations and tribes, poisonous serpents, let alone the poison of sin and selfishness, and much more. It was a dangerous journey. To the eyes of those watching them pass by, people who were settled, the people of Israel must have appeared to be nothing more than a ragged band of wanderers, a people without a home, apparently on a journey to nowhere. But at least they were a people. To be born a son or daughter of Israel was to be part of something with a history, and, as their God had promised them, also with a future. To be a child of Israel was not to be alone. And yet, our first reading from that time shows us the opposite. It contains one small part of what the scholars call Israel's ritual law of purity. And it describes, that reading we heard, how the community was to respond to the appearance within it of diseases of the skin such as leprosy. Now, the law that we heard regarding leprosy was very practical. And something like that feels probably familiar to us in this time of COVID because, like COVID, leprosy was known to be a communicable disease and a fatal one at that. So separation, as that law we heard prescribed, that separation was a practical necessity. But as we ourselves are experiencing with stay-at-home orders, quarantines, and lockdowns, just because something makes practical sense doesn't mean it provides a good experience for those affected. Here is what happened in ancient Israel. Here is what we heard. Anyone who has the leprous disease shall wear torn clothes, and let the hair of their head be disheveled, and shall cover their upper lip and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." That person shall remain unclean as long as the disease persists. And being unclean, such a one shall live alone, with their dwelling outside the camp. Practical indeed. But practical though that law was, our current experience with COVID helps us to see more clearly, perhaps, what it meant for the people involved. They were condemned to be separated from those whom they loved and who loved them. They were cast out of the community that gave them their identity. They were to live alone, with their dwelling outside the camp. And, absent a visible and obvious healing of the disease, it was a life sentence. It would be no exaggeration to describe a leper in ancient Israel as lost. Physical pain and suffering came along with this disease, but as we try to imagine the experience, and indeed as it was actually experienced as well, loneliness and isolation seem perhaps to be as big a burden that needed to be carried. And so it can be for us as well. And so it has been for many among us, even before COVID. How so? Well, last week we talked about how the weight of our burdens may end up leaving us feeling lost, weighed down and unable to raise our head to see a way forward. But those same burdens can have another powerful effect. They can also leave us feeling isolated and alone. Think about it. Each of us has a vision of the person we want to be. And very often our burdens leave us feeling that we'll just never be able to become that person. And even worse, because nobody seems to be advertising that they're in the same situation, we can end up feeling that it is somehow our fault, that we are the only one. We can be left feeling ashamed, feeling judged, feeling that we are alone, feeling lost. Now, sometimes, to our discredit as a Christian people, that feeling is correct. Sometimes we do judge others unjustly. But sometimes the judgment involved is mostly self-judgment. Either way, we can end up feeling isolated and alone. And because of that feeling, we end up making choices that reinforce rather than change our situation, that leave us more alone than ever. And there's another way many of us can come to feel lost and isolated. Each of us is unique. No two persons are identical. But sometimes in our life experience, it can come to seem that who we are, who I am, alienates me from others, even from my family and community. It seems that I cannot explain myself and my experience to them. Or maybe they just can't understand what I have to say. Again, such a thing is possible. It happens. It's not necessary, and I would say it's avoidable, but it is definitely possible. It is an experience that many have had and are having. But once again, that feeling, that experience can leave us and cause us to make choices that reinforce rather than change our situation. Choices that can leave us more isolated and alone than ever. So what can we do? Well, whether we are the one who feels we are living alone outside the camp, or whether we know and love someone whom we believe feels that way, what can we do? Well, like the human person, life can be complicated, but there are two things we can definitely do. The first of them is personal. To talk about it, I am going to make up my own definition for a very well-known word, a particularly well-known word to we Christians. And more than that, I'm going to give this word a different spelling that it actually has, and that word is forgive. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an E to that first syllable, forgive. And so I create a new word of my own invention. And I'm going to, because it's my word, I'm going to define it my way. I'm going to define it like this: to give first. Now, that probably sounds pretty basic, and in a sense it is. But to feel alone, to feel that you are living outside the camp, means that something very dear to you, something you really need, is missing, or worse, and this is common, has been taken away. And when something is taken from us, we desire, rightly so, that it should be given back. Much of our pain, in fact, comes from the reality that just doesn't seem to happen. I'm going to suggest that a good first step to regaining what we are missing, what has been taken, is not to sit waiting for someone to give us what we need. That's kind of a natural response. Instead, we should forgive. Give first. Because sometimes at least we can give back what others seem to have taken from us. But we should give it not to ourselves, but to them. If we have been denied a listening ear, we should listen carefully to the people around us. If we have been harshly criticized, we should offer support and affirmation. If we have been unfairly judged by someone close to us, we should avoid judging them in return. Simply put, we should give what we want to receive. We should forgive. Because if criticism, judgment, and a deaf ear can leave us feeling and being alone, the opposite is also true. In giving to others what they should be giving to us, we can help lighten their burden. And in lightening their burden, we also lighten our own. Now, one great way we can listen to one another and lighten one another's burdens is by participating in a small group. A small group is a place where Christians do not just church together, but life together. It happens outside the four walls of the church. More than that, small groups are a place where we choose to do life together. By choosing to join a small group, you are choosing community over isolation and loneliness for yourself, but by your presence and participation for others as well. So we can forgive. We can give first. We can choose to do life together. And here is a challenge for all of you. I want you to take a step and forgive. To do that, just send an email to smallgroups@stpiusbrantford.ca. smallgroups@stpiusbrantford.ca. Just register your interest, that's all. It's not a lifetime commitment, it's an email. And you will have a chance to learn more and to think about it further during Lent, when we will be talking about it much more. But register your interest and your desire to forgive. I'm challenging you to do that, to take a step for your sake or perhaps for others who would benefit from your presence, from your listening ear, and from your presence in their lives. Or for people like you, people who believe that their life is better connected. That is important. But the second thing we can do, I said there were two, the second thing we can do is even more important, and that is to learn from today's gospel story. Because you and I can do a lot for each other, but there is someone who can do more. Because he can change not just our situation and our experience, but our heart and our very self. The leper in today's gospel knew that. As we have said, he was someone carrying a terrible burden, a burden not just of physical illness, but also of isolation, the judgment of others, and loneliness. But he boldly chose to draw near to Jesus. And this was what he said: "If you choose, you can make me clean." And we should listen carefully to Jesus' reply. "I do choose." Why was that his answer? Well, the Son of Man, as we have heard, the Son of Man, Jesus, came to seek out and to save the lost. And so we, like the leper, need to be bold. We need to come near to Jesus and to say to him, "If you choose," and he will. And so through him, with him, and in him, what is already good about your life will be strengthened, and what is missing will be restored, so that you can truly become the person you desire to be, so that what has been lost will be found, not just by the Lord, but by you as well.